Hello, and welcome to Edina's Speaking of Authors. I'm Susan Tarnowski, a volunteer for the City of Edina, and in this series, we tell all of the stories. The story the author has written, the story the author has lived, the stories that our readers bring to our literature, and perhaps the way they live their lives following intersection with those works. Today we welcome Courtney Burnett, a physician and author of Difficult Gifts. To Courtney, difficult gifts are ones that teach us, motivate us, change us, and inspire us. That gift for Courtney, as we will see, involves a diagnosis of a severe illness. It also involves an exploration of spirituality and, really for Courtney, a new life view. I'll introduce our interviewer, Barbara Lavaleur. Barbara is a journalist and memoirist, and Barbara will introduce our author. I think we'll be very interested to see how your questions allow our author to tell this story. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you, Susan. I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
So let's bring in Courtney.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for that introduction. So today we welcome Courtney. Thank you for coming, Courtney. You have quite a story to tell.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Great. I look forward to asking you a bunch of questions, so I hope you're ready.
Bring it on.
All right, good. So just as a way of introducing yourself to our audience, would you share a bit about not only yourself, but your background and what led you to write this book, and during the pandemic of all things?
It's a great question and a big question.
Right.
So to give you the brief introduction, I'm a Minnesotan. I was raised out in the western suburbs. I grew up and decided I wanted to either be a teacher or a physician. After many years, I went into the medical route where I could not only practice medicine but also teach in that realm. And so I spent most of my life in some form of school and training and learning to become a practicing physician. Mm-hmm. In my very last year of training, decades into this ordeal, I was diagnosed with cancer in a very unexpected way that we'll talk about in time. It just so happened to also be the very beginning of the pandemic. At that time and early on in my diagnosis, no one was quite sure how long I had. And I thought, I have some things to say in my time here, mm-hmm. and I need to say it now. So I wrote.
Yes, very good, very good. So thank you. So one of the things that I admired most about your book was the refreshing, open, and honest way you talk about death and dying. You're dying. Mm-hmm. I'm dying. We're all dying. From the moment we're born, we're dying. The thing is that most people don't want to talk about that. I remember so well, I lived in Europe for 20 years, and during that time in Germany, I belonged to an English discussion group, and the women were all international, often married to different nationality of Europeans, and we had a topic for each month, and we rotated who would be facilitating the conversation. So the year that I was in charge, I said, let's talk about death and dying. And oh my, the reaction was palpable. Mm-hmm. No one wanted to talk about that. And surprisingly, a couple of women had never experienced death, mm-hmm. either of a family member or a friend or anything. And wow, I was about 40, and I had been experiencing death since the age of 11 when my grandma died. Mm-hmm. So, and wow, it was quite the conversation. So anyway, I did convince them, and we did have that conversation, and it was they were all thankful that we'd had it after we had it, actually. So your journey seems particularly unique given the timing and your profession. So would you walk us through maybe a short version, I mean, it doesn't have to be so short, but a short version of your book's story, like maybe where it starts and where it goes and where you come back to?
Absolutely. So the basis of the book was that, again, while I was in my last year of medical training, I had the opportunity to spend some time in Thailand doing a global health elective rotation. It was wonderful. And at the time, I was not only finishing my training, but I was going through a challenging personal time in my life. I was facing pretty severe depression. I was going through a divorce, and I felt I just needed a little bit of an escape, a change in my life, and to learn something very unique. I also felt on a more professional level that although I felt very strongly trained in Western medicine, I had really little knowledge of Eastern medicine or medicine elsewhere in the world. And here, especially in Minnesota, we have patients from all over the world, and I thought I need to broaden my understanding of how to treat all of these people with the care and the cultural competence that they deserve from me. And so I chose Thailand because it had a very unique program there at a sort of sister hospital where I could learn a lot of techniques in Eastern medicine. Things that we don't always learn here in our typical training, like acupuncture and Thai massage, meditation, other techniques. And so I was planning to spend about 6 weeks in Chiang Mai, Thailand, a northern city, big urban city. Beautiful for anyone who's been there or needs a travel recommendation. I could talk about that all day. But I went and was feeling great. It was wonderful to be there. I felt alive and free and like I was, traveling there on my own and learning something brand new. And so I spent a few weeks there, ironically being reassigned from the Eastern medicine, sort of complementary medicine clinic, to work in a cancer center because that clinic was closed when I first arrived. So I spent my first few weeks working with cancer patients in Thailand, and then spent another week working on a palliative medicine team, a team that focuses on end-of-life care, death and dying, which we have in the U.S. as well. And we can talk more about that later. But so fantastic experiences. And finally, one of the last weeks I was there, the complementary medicine clinic where I would learn more of the Eastern-based medicine opened. And I was able to spend some time there. And day one, I came down with strange symptoms. And to keep it short, I had these little episodes of very strange neurologic symptoms, a little tingling in my hand, a little difficulty swallowing. They'd happen for about 30 seconds. I was awake and talking and seemed fine otherwise. Brushed it off, thinking I'm stressed about something, maybe I have a little infection, who knows, right? And they kept happening more and more frequently until the point where I said, I need to sort of switch into my doctor hat, so to speak. What would I do if a patient came to me and said, I'm having these little episodes? And I'd say, you're probably having seizures. So I talked to some of my colleagues and said, I need to go into the doctor and I need to get an MRI of my brain.
Wow, that must have been scary.
It was scary, yes, it was scary. But yes, so that's how it went. And a lot of the book talks about my experience having these symptoms, going through this diagnosis, and I ended up getting this MRI in Thailand and diagnosing myself with a brain tumor, which landed me as a patient in the hospital in Thailand before I was rushed home on quite an amusing flight to undergo brain surgery here in Minnesota.
Well, hats off to you and your sense of humor to bring that in the face of what you were facing, for heaven's sakes. Wow. One of the things that stood out for me was several times you made reference to not deserving the support and the compliments you were getting from various people, people you spent time with. I was wondering what that's all about, because normally, as a patient, you would get support from your friends and your family. Do you think that was because of your role as a physician and not being able to separate the two? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm just wondering.
I'm sure that played a role, definitely. I was, for the first time in my life, experiencing being a patient literally in the location I worked.
Right.
So it was a very surreal experience.
Yeah.
I also think the way I describe a diagnosis of cancer is it's almost like having a birthday every day that you never wanted to have, where you get gifts and calls and support, and it's wonderful, but it is sort of unexpected and difficult in a way, I think, to process. You're processing not only a new diagnosis and dealing with that, and then you're receiving so much love and support, which is wonderful, but I think it is overwhelming. And when I was writing at the time, I was overwhelmed on all standpoints.
I can't imagine writing in that. I mean, I mentioned that I'd written my memoir over a 4-year period, but I wasn't under that kind of stress, I can tell you. You know, your book has a lot of interesting moments. It's not all sad, you know, it's not all about death and dying. There was one thing that really made me laugh out loud, and that was when I read the compliment after you'd had surgery, and one of your surgeons said, "You have a nice looking brain."
It was my favorite compliment that I've ever received. I love it. I'd rather be complimented on my brain than anything else for all of eternity.
I just thought that was so funny. I was pleased that you included that. So how has the experience of brain cancer changed you, or maybe given you a different outlook on life, if it has, if you think it has?
Oh, it's changed everything for me. It's changed my entire life. Brain cancer, the type that I have, is an incurable cancer. So it is something I will live with until either it kills me or I'm really unlucky and something else gets me first.
Okay.
But it is a unique experience to be, at the time, 29, diagnosed with an incurable terminal illness. You're sort of given, here's what you will die from someday, but not a clear timeline. And so I realized I could sort of do one of two things. I could curl up in bed in the fetal position and be sad, or I could embrace every moment that I am able to continue living this beautiful life. So I chose that one.
Wow.
And so I'm glad that you brought up that this book is not all about death and dying. It's a
No.
topic that is there and it's woven in.
Yes.
And what I like to say now when I talk with people about my experience is that as someone in the medical field, there's only one thing medically certain in all of our lives, and that's the fact that we'll die.
Right.
We don't like to think about it, as you said, especially in this culture, not the
Yeah.
case everywhere.
That's true.
And we definitely don't like to think about it, but it is, we can do whatever we can to improve the quality, the quantity of our lives, but we cannot not die. We
Right.
just cannot.
Yeah.
So I touch on death and dying in my book, but I also talk about it from the perspective of how do we live, because we all will face an ending someday.
Yes.
And how do we make the most of our time before that happens? And so that perspective is refreshing to me. It's something that in my 20s I never thought I would be thinking about, which looking back is maybe a little silly. I saw death and dying in my job every day. Just didn't really think it would apply to me.
Right.
And now I can see things in a different light, and it has changed my life dramatically. I spend so much more time enjoying the small moments, the moments where I'm just sitting with my fiance on the couch, right, where I'm having dinner with my parents, where I'm going on a walk with my dog. Those are beautiful moments that are in many ways more important than the grand trips we take or the things we might put on our bucket list. So that has been a really wonderful new perspective for me.
Wow. That is a wonderful life lesson. I love that. It seems like you have experienced an increased empathy for others, especially your patients. Can you say more about that? Having been not only on one side of the white coat, but on the other side?
Yes, I'm glad you asked about that. I do think that in many ways, becoming a patient has made me a better physician. Not only more empathetic in my job, but in my personal life as well. I think that I touch a lot on the concepts of suffering and compassion, and what that means and how we can use those concepts in relating to other people. I think to start with my outlook on this is in my profession, being a patient is challenging. And even as a physician, I would have thought that maybe made things easier for me, and I'm sure it did in many ways. I knew what to expect. But I also noticed that, wow, many things are not explained well to patients. Not by anyone's fault other than the system and time.
Right.
And it's very scary, no matter how much medical knowledge you have. And so that outlook helps me relate more to my own patients. I tell most of the patients I work with that I'm also a patient, and I talk with them about my diagnosis, and we share battle stories, so to speak, and I think it just brings us all closer. We are all just human, and we're facing this as humans with empathy for one another.
I would think that would be very gratifying to be one of your patients. So Difficult Gifts is the title of your book, and I love the cover, the design. It's really beautiful. It's very, very peaceful. What does that mean to you, the difficult gifts? Can you say a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So a lot of my book, for those who have read it or maybe thinking about reading it, I draw on a lot of inspirational quotes from writers and teachers far wiser than I am. And I tie in stories of my life and my diagnosis to those quotes and lessons. And as I was reading a book on some spiritual philosophy, so to speak, I came across a quote by a Benedictine monk. And this quote essentially said that we should learn to embrace the difficult gifts in life. It was a much longer quote than that, but I had never heard something of that concept. When we think of a gift, we think happy, opening a present, joy. And I don't think we often think about a gift that is difficult. I wrote about this and thought about this in a way that I think we can all relate to now when we think about pandemic, for instance. Let's say we got I bring up a silly example, but we got a 5,000 piece puzzle for Christmas and thought, when will I ever in my life do this horrible puzzle? Never. What a horrible gift. And then a pandemic traps us in our home. And we think, well, thank God I have this horrible puzzle to keep me occupied. So I think there are many things that's a silly example, but there are gifts we get that don't seem so great when we get them.
Have you finished it?
Some of them, yes.
Okay, very good. Okay. Your aunt sent you a book by Sharon Salzberg called Faith after you separated from your husband. How did that book impact you? And you seem to be a voracious reader. So always reading
I love
something.
to read, always reading something, yes.
Yes.
Yes, Faith is a great book. I was thrown off by the title, I'll say at first. I love Sharon Salzberg and her teachings now. I think Faith was the first book I read by her. She is a Buddhist teacher and a wonderful writer. I guess I will say that I was raised one religion, and I don't necessarily practice that religion, and I write about this in the book. I didn't necessarily think of myself as a very spiritual or religious person, so I was surprised to get a book called Faith. And when I finally sat down and read it while I was going through a hard time, I realized that faith is a word that means so much more than religion or spirituality.
Yes.
And it was a book not so much about what I traditionally thought of as spiritual, but of hope and optimism and compassion for others. And that changed my whole view of how to look at tough situations.
Yeah. It seems that you come from a family of writers. Who was it that you said was also published? Was that your grandmother?
My grandmother was, yes.
Okay.
She wrote mostly children and young adult literature, and
Very cool.
yes. So
Yeah. So a family trait. What do you want people to be left with after they've read Difficult Gifts? You speak about at the end of the book that about worry, and so I have the question I just asked. Plus, I'd like to tag on to that your thoughts about worrying and how you came to that understanding about worrying. So, first things first. What would you like people to be left with?
Yes, what would I like people to be left with? That's a great question. I think if I had to sum it up in one word, I would say hope. If I had a little bit of a longer answer, I would say I want to convey, I think, 2 to 3 very important concepts. The first being the word compassion, and what does that mean? And literally that word means suffering with someone else. And I think that when we see that other people are suffering, in fact, everyone is suffering in some way, just that knowledge and that perspective, I think, is a way to have compassion and to feel closer to everyone else around you. I think, too, is realizing, on that same framework, realizing that we are all going through a hard time, even if it doesn't look like it. And when we are able to, at least for me, when I'm able to shift my perspective and see that I'm not the only one who suffers, I feel so much less alone. My own suffering becomes this big when you think about the suffering that's going on elsewhere. So it's a way that, not to ignore what you're feeling, but to look at it from the perspective that things really aren't so bad. Yeah. So I think those would be the two big ones, and 3 being enjoy those small moments, because those small moments, when you look back on your life, may be the big ones.
And what about your take on worry and worrying?
So the Dalai Lama said a quote about worrying that really sticks with me. And he said, if a problem is fixable, why worry? If a problem is not fixable, why worry, right? If you can fix it, fix it. And if you can't fix it, well, that's what it is. So worrying is just an emotion that kind of gets in the way of everything else. It doesn't really belong.
Very good. You seem to be very wise for such a young woman. On page 181, you write, the real purpose of this chaos we called life is loving others and having compassion for others. I thought that was beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I also wrote down the unknown Buddhist monk that you quote. Smile, do not cry. This happened for a reason.
Absolutely. That was part of the book, a little bit of a spoiler, but one of the most life-changing moments for me when I was a patient in Thailand shortly after my diagnosis. And here in America, for those who have illness or are familiar with the hospital systems and what that might feel like, if you are in the hospital and you are quite ill, you can call on a chaplain or someone from the spiritual team to come and talk with you. In Thailand, I had been working with a wonderful group of palliative care practitioners, and I had wanted to talk with a monk at a temple while I was in Thailand. I have always been fascinated by Buddhist culture, both from a spiritual standpoint, but also just the psychology behind what a lot of Buddhists practice. And so I had written down every day in my calendar while I was there, go to the temple, talk with a monk, because they're free and they sit with you and just answer your life questions. And when I was sitting in that hospital bed, I was so sad. I had a brain tumor, but despite that, I had never gotten to talk with a monk. So I asked my palliative care colleagues, I said, will you just please find a monk who might be willing to come and talk with me? And they brought in someone in his bright orange robe, and he walked in and sat down, and I told him my story. And I remember he was sitting there, hands folded, just smiling and laughing, and looked so joyful. And I'm kind of like, are you understanding what I'm saying? I'm very distraught here. He just looks at me and he says, well, illness and death are a natural part of life. Smile, don't cry. This happens for a reason. And something switched, and I thought, I've gone through decades of medical school training, right, of some degree. I've gone through years and years of training, and this is the best medical advice I've ever heard. Illness and death, they happen, and we can get through it.
Wow. So I think I mentioned this. I found your book really inspiring. I laughed. I shed some tears. But what I was left with was wonder. Really just wonder. So thank you so much for this incredible conversation, which gets over way too soon. And good luck with your book. I believe you're also available for speaking engagements. Do you want to look to our viewers and say where they can buy your book, as well as contact you for speaking engagements?
Absolutely, and thank you again for having me here. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
I would love for others to read my book. I especially give a shout out that I do donate much of my profits to different brain cancer awareness and advocacy groups. So not just for me, but to help all those out here dealing with this illness. But my book is available really anywhere that books are sold. I have a website where I write a blog, which is how I started writing. It's called elephantlotusbraintumor.com. So the book's available there. You can also reach out to me there and contact me for any type of speaking event. I do many speaking events to book clubs, to patient and physician groups, or just motivational talks about embracing this crazy thing called life.
So, Courtney, you're dying. I'm dying. We're all dying. I think the most important thing and takeaway from your book is to make the most of every day, every minute. Because whether we've got a few months or a few years, we've got a lifetime ahead of us. So, thank you so much. And now, we're going to go back to Susan.
Well, thank you, Barbara, and thank you so much, Courtney. Courtney said in her interview, becoming a patient has made me a better physician. I think she describes that simply and beautifully in this quote from her book. It's in the chapter called "This is Our Moment." I recently learned how important it is to be present, to be mindful of what's happening right now, in this moment. The past is gone, the future is not promised. We are only guaranteed this exact moment, precisely as it is. She also told us in her interview that her developing philosophy is, if you see something that can be fixed, fix it. If not, walk away. Worry is not a useful emotion for us. Honestly, I would like Courtney as my physician. So I want to say thank you for the beautiful book that Courtney has written, for sharing so much of a really difficult time in life that she has made into the way she lives her life now. Barbara, thank you so much for your interview questions. What a lovely conversation we've had. You can find where to buy Courtney's book on her website, at Amazon, and Barnes & Noble as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. All of our other episodes of Speaking of Authors here in Edina are available on the Edina website in their YouTube channel. We encourage you to take a look and see the other authors we have had. Thank you so much.